Well, joining us out of San Francisco is former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer Scott Bennett. Scott, many thanks for joining us today. My first question for you is that the OPEC Plus's decision to slash output is happening just ahead of the cold winter months and when most European countries are already looking at fuel shortages. Do you see the OPEC Plus a decision, a technical one as they insist, or a political one?
Well, I think we have to look at this decision in context of all of the global operations that are being conducted. And this isn't happening in isolation. This is occurring in concert with a variety of plate tectonic paradigm shifts politically. We witness, of course, the war in Russia and Ukraine being amplified very dramatically with Russia's counterstrike against the terrorist attacks against its Crimean bridge and its Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So I think Russia is accelerating the war, and you could see Ukraine and Zelensky and the Ukrainian regime being disintegrated and dismantled in 2 to 4 weeks. That would be my prediction. In addition, you see China beginning to set the stage for a siege of Taiwan because the U.S. is foolishly doing what it did in World War II, which is cutting off the Japanese from oil, and now the U.S. is trying to cut off the Chinese from computer chips. And ultimately, we come to Saudi Arabia, and the short-term tantrum that is emanating out of Washington is simply because the Democrats realize that the Saudis are looking into their own best interests. They're not obeying the Washington slave masters anymore, and they are taking their own oil revenues and doing their own calculations without listening to Washington. That is going to translate into higher oil prices, like you wisely observed, and that will cause a major political defeat of the Democrats in November. Now, that is why the Democrats are screaming mad, but it's all bluff. The United States will never remove its weapons from Saudi Arabia unless it's forced to. And I would hope Saudi Arabia would say, if you want to leave, leave. Please leave our country, leave our shores, because you've been nothing but a source of instability and antagonism ever since the first Gulf War. But I would also predict that I could see the United States doing an assassination of the Mohammed bin Salman, a regime change, a color revolution, some sort of a, well, similar regime change that they've done against Ukraine in 2013. So the U.S. is going through its own perestroika. It is losing all of its influence around all of the different nations of the world. It has lost the art of diplomacy. It has lost any statesman-like rhetoric and sophistication that nations have traditionally had, and you're witnessing a disintegration of the U.S. political influence almost as fast as its national sanity is also disintegration under its various pathologies of wokeism, climate change, LGBT, homosexual rights. All of these things that the West has been pursuing has been isolating it, and I think the same goes for the European Union. So the globalists that have been in these positions of power in the European Union and NATO and the United States realize their time is short, and they're reacting violently in a desperate attempt to survive.
Scott, the White House has already accused Saudi Arabia of siding with Russia, and now we're hearing voices within the Biden administration calling for restrictions to arms sales to Riyadh. How do you predict things will play out in terms of the relations between the two countries?
You know, I think this is a very interesting opportunity to, ironically, reset the relationship between Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran, because with the U.S. becoming increasingly desperate and fanatical, frantic, and irrational, you have the opportunity for Iran to make overtures to Saudi Arabia and say, in this multipolar world that's developing, and with the U.S. Doubling down on its global, war of hegemony, let Iran and Saudi Arabia use Russia as a middleman for settling some of the tensions and conflicts so that Saudi Arabia feels it has the room to maneuver and perhaps set up a new political orientation towards the BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Group. And you may see Iran and Saudi Arabia at least have an appeasement opportunity, a stabilizing effect that they didn't have before, because the United States and Israel had been driving all of the Saudi Arabian policy. So as Saudi Arabia does incline more in the way of Russia, as it does incline more towards a multipolar world with some of these more international organizations, as Saudi Arabia is stabbed in the back and called backstabbers by the frantic, hysterical Democrats like Menendez and Biden and Schumer and all of these Jewish, Israeli, pro-Zionist, pro-neocon globalist types, as Saudi Arabia finds them increasingly irritating and offensive, perhaps it would give an opportunity for Iran to be pleasant, floral, persuasive, and attractive in setting up a new opportunity for new relationship cultivation. So I see this as as the U.S. becomes very deeply offensive to Saudi Arabia and strikes at its pride and makes insulting accusations and makes threats of cutting off all oil, weapons, and agreements, I think Iran and Russia have an opportunity to bring Saudi Arabia more into their orbit. And I think this is the effect that is going to also replicate in Europe as nations reject the terroristic war of empire that the globalists, led by Joe Biden and Ursula von der Leyen and Liz Truss and Macron and all of the rest of these globalist types, as the real world, which is India, Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, as all of these nations begin to recoagulate and form more of a multipolar front, I think you will have a lot more opportunities for the cessation of hostilities, the reduction of tension through joint sovereign economic relationships. And if Saudi Arabia was guaranteed no militancy or conquests or acts of aggression by Iran through a proxy of Russia, I think you may have a very interesting opportunity to settle a lot of the grievances and isolate and ostracize the United States and prevent it from any further acts of friction or at what it's always good at, which is regime change, color revolutions, assassination, and the thorough pirating and theft of the natural resources of other countries, as we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya. So I think as Saudi Arabia matures and begins to shift away diplomatically and politically from the West, new doors and new opportunities and new relationships could possibly be struck.
Very interesting how things would plan out in the near future. Many thanks to Scott Bennett for joining us, former U.S. Army psychological officer, joining us from San Francisco. Many thanks.